Hello, fellow historians. Well, here we are in the strange new world of coronavirus lockdown, but I thought I'd just spend a bit of time talking to you about the details of health and the people in the Middle Ages that you should be familiar with and that we would have perhaps been looking at if we were still in school. So, in order to do that, my wife has found me an artist's easel, and we've got the textbook here, and all we'll do is talk about some of the pages and talk about some of the issues and the things that you should be aware of when thinking about the Middle Ages and medicine and health through time. Okay, so obviously there's 4 time periods in Britain, health and the people, and the first one is the Middle Ages. But we have to start by firstly getting some idea of what life in the Middle Ages was like, and then think about some of the influences on medicine in the Middle Ages, which came from the time before or the times before, and came from other areas of the world and influenced medicine in Great Britain. So you might remember these pictures, which we've looked at in our classwork. But really, we use those to kind of just remind ourselves of what a rural society Britain was in the Middle Ages, that most people worked on the land, most people were farmers. There were 2 really important kind of institutions, organizations. One was obviously the government, and the other one was the church, because people were so religious and people were, followed the Bible, or at least followed the church's interpretation of the Bible very closely. This gave the church a huge amount of power, which had a large influence on medicine at this time. Okay, the other thing we talked about was this guy down here, exemplifying the fact that there was a lot of warfare in the Middle Ages, and this took up a lot of time of government, and the government spent a lot of time involved in war. And war, as we know, is one of our themes of the different themes that we have at the back of our book when we're thinking about medicine. And war in the Middle Ages, it takes a lot of time from the government, so they're not spending time thinking about the health and the welfare of the people. But at the same time, it can prompt, medical discoveries, as we're going to see when we head into our second time period that we will be looking at. Okay, and then obviously this last little picture here is just about the ordinary lives of ordinary people, and we've got our sort of medieval farmstead there, and the people are living very, very closely with animals. And this is going to kind of, provide kind of a transmission of diseases between animals and humans. Not much idea of standards of cleanliness as we would understand them, and not really a connection between dirt and disease, although we will revisit that when we think about miasma theory. Okay, a lot of people in the Middle Ages, they didn't have much understanding of what caused disease. Access to healthcare was very difficult. People who were rich could perhaps pay to visit a physician or an apothecary, but most people had to kind of make do with their own remedies for illness and their own treatments when people became unwell. Meanwhile, there's a huge amount of superstition in the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church is teaching that the world is a war ground between good and evil, and that amount of superstition or that kind of concept of this other kind of supernatural world provides people with a way of understanding illness, whereby it's perhaps seen as a punishment or possession, that your kind of illness is part of this battle between God and the devil, or God and demons. They really didn't understand the causes of disease, as we will see. Okay, so our first proper lessons on medicine in the Middle Ages, we started by talking about some of the influences that came to the Middle Ages, the most significant ones being that if you think of the different elements of medical care, you can kind of find traces of them, even though they're modern. You can find traces of them way back in human history. So the first concept of a specialist, we might call him a doctor now, but a physician, you can see that in kind of Egypt, and the fact that the pharaoh would have a court physician. The concept of hospitals, you can see that in terms of the Asclepion, which is where Greeks would go and worship Asclepius up in the mountains. It's somewhere where you can go to get healing. They thought they were getting healing from the god Asclepius, but it would involve rest. It would involve sitting in the mountains, getting the fresh air, and we might think of that as being kind of the forerunner of a hospital. And we also kind of see things like the concept of operations, concept that you might kind of have like some kind of surgery. When we think about trepanning, which is the drilling of a hole in the skull of someone who's got a headache, we think it was probably for that reason, and we can find that way back in the Stone Age, where we still have or we find now Stone Age skulls, which have holes in where the person has been trepanned. Okay. What we also discussed and what we also think about is how European medicine was influenced by what could be seen as more advanced medicine from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, because whilst Europe was racked by conflict and war and different kings fighting each other, and the sort of power struggles between the church and the monarchy, the Muslim world was much more settled. It was largely ruled under a caliphate, so a much bigger kind of empire, if you like. And in that empire, much of the learning of Greece and Rome had been preserved, and some of the Muslim doctors had kind of moved ahead of what could be seen as quite brutal medicine in Europe to something a little bit more along the lines of observation, looking at symptoms, thinking about causes of disease in a more kind of calculated and careful manner. The most important people for that are a guy called Avicenna, which is spelled Avicena. I'll say that again. Avicena, sometimes spelt in a slightly different way, which is IBN, new word, Senna, Ibn Sena. And he was a Muslim doctor, and he was one of the most prolific writers of medical texts in the Muslim world. And another doctor to be aware of is one called Rhazes, which is Rhazes. And Rhazes was the first doctor one of the first doctors to put an emphasis on looking at symptoms, and he isolated the idea that you might have like individual diseases that are caused by individual symptoms, and looking at the symptoms might tell you which disease the person's got. And he described the symptoms of smallpox originally. But the other thing that's happening in the Muslim world is with much less fighting, much less conflict. There's more investment in kind of the building of buildings for medical treatments. Again, we would think of them as hospitals, and those hospitals are kind of often quite peaceful places. They're built around fountains. They've got kind of courtyards, and again, they're for the richer people in the Muslim world, but at least they're developing this idea of somewhere to go for treatment that we would think of as a hospital. Okay. The final influence, and by far the most important one to be aware of on Muslim medicine, is shown in this diagram here, which is obviously the theory of the four humours, which you really must be familiar with. The concept being that there were four liquids in the human body that had to be kept in balance, and you could look at what was happening to someone's body, what they were saying about their body, and that would tell you as a physician, as an apothecary, which of their humours was out of balance. And this idea was developed first by Hippocrates, who is he's a Greek doctor, and then it was influenced by Galen, who was a Roman, and we're talking here 1,500 years before sort of our story starts in the Middle Ages, when Hippocrates first comes out with the theory of the four humours around about that time. And that theory becomes, embedded in people's understanding of what's happening in the body. Because although we all own one, if you think about your insides, it's kind of pink and mushy and dark, I suppose. And really, it's so close to you, and yet it's probably the place you know least about of all the places you ever visit. And there it is inside you, and you can't look at it, you can't go in there, you can't there's no no roadmap. Certainly in the Middle Ages there wasn't, to what's happening inside the body. So what they're doing is looking instead at what's coming out of the body, and using that to understand what must be going on inside. So the four humours, if we talk about them, you've got blood, you've got phlegm, you've got black bile, and you've got yellow bile. Of those four, we know what three of them are. Blood is blood, phlegm is snot, and yellow bile is vomit. Black bile, no one's 100% sure on what the ancient Greeks thought black bile was. It could be the kind of liquid that comes up when you have finished vomiting and there's nothing left in there, and you're starting to vomit up sort of blood particles from your stomach, and obviously that's going to be quite dark. It's going to be bloody. It could also be if you've got blood that starts to clot. If you sort of bled somebody with a leech or whatever, or bled them with a cup, and you've got some blood in a jar, and it starts to clot, it'll go kind of quite dark as it kind of interacts with the oxygen in the atmosphere, and that could have been what they meant by black bile, but no one's quite sure. But the point is that you've got these four liquids that are coming out of the body in some way, and they're perhaps giving us an idea of what's going on inside. They're kind of the closest thing we've got to a map of what's going on inside. Now, these four liquids became linked with the four elements in Greek thinking, and they sort of exemplify kind of the idea that the Greeks had, that maybe there was a designer to the world, and there were four elements that were combined in different ways to create all of the sort of variety of objects around us. And at the same time, in a human body, you've got these four liquids which have to be in balance. And if they're in balance, you're well. If they're out of balance, you are ill. Okay, the theory says nothing about why they might be out of balance, but it does give you a mechanism for how to treat somebody, which is to get their humours back into balance. And the way to do that would usually be to take out something they have too much of. And there is obviously another way of getting humours into balance, which is to put in the things that they don't have. But, it's pretty disgusting, the idea that you might drink somebody else's vomit in order to increase the amount of yellow bile you've got. Instead, they were thinking about taking things out of the body. And you can obviously eat certain herbs, you can eat certain what we would call chemicals, and they will make you sick. So they would purge you, which would be to kind of get you to vomit. If the doctor thinks you've got, or the physician thinks you've got too much yellow bile, you can also sort of do things that make you kind of obviously sort of poo and diarrhea. That also is going to be a way of perhaps getting black bile out of your body. If you have a cold, you might kind of put your head over a steaming bowl of water, which is going to loosen up your phlegm, and that's going to get your phlegm out. And we know about leeches and cupping, which was using hot cups to kind of draw the blood out of you in order to take the blood out. And all those things are ways of getting rid of some of the humours. And this became so embedded in sort of the way people thought about the world, that people would describe themselves as being the kind of personality that has an over exuberance of blood. They've got too much blood, they're choleric or whatever, and then they would kind of regularly, it's a bit like going to the gym, going to the spa. Instead of doing that, they're going to a physician, and they get bled every couple of weeks in order to kind of try and keep their humours in balance so that they don't get ill. Or they might go with a specific kind of symptom and say, well, this symptom, I feel hot and dry, and the physician says, well, you've got too much yellow bile, drink this liquid and we'll get some of that yellow bile out of yourself. And in a way as well, that there is some sense to it, because if you've got a tummy ache and then you are sick, you can often feel better. So in that way, you are actually kind of doing the kind of thing that they're talking about, and you might feel better. Similarly, if you've got a headache, you've got sort of lots of snot in your nose, you blow your nose, you get some of the phlegm out, and you feel better. So again, there is you can see that at least they're looking at the body itself. They're not praying to gods, they're not praying to, in Hippocrates' case, the Olympian gods of Zeus and Apollo. In the Christian world, they're not praying to Jesus or God. Instead, they're looking at symptoms. They're observing the body, and that's giving them the clues that they feel they can then use to work out how to treat people who are ill. And in that way, the theory of the four humours, although it's wrong, you can argue that it's less wrong than the religious explanations that were happening at the time, that were going around at the time in terms of the Catholic Church. Okay, just one more thing to talk about here is the influence of Galen specifically in a wider sense, which is that Galen was a gladiator doctor, so he worked in a gladiator school, so he had access to bodies of obviously injured gladiators and treatments and things. But there was still a taboo against dissection at the time of Galen. Galen's importance is that he wrote in Latin because he was a Roman. He'd read the works of Hippocrates, which were written in Greek. Galen, when he wrote about medicine, talked about a creator God, and he wrote in Latin, which meant that the Catholic Church, which also used Latin all the way through the Middle Ages as its language, found Galen quite appealing, to the extent that Galen and the works of Galen were the documents that were taught in the university schools run by the churches, and Galen's writings became known across Europe. And because he talked about a creator God, and because the church didn't really want to encourage people to question, you were expected to accept the works of Galen's without any question, even to the point whereby if dissections took place in the medieval world and they contradicted the works of Galen, then the argument would be that the body was wrong. Galen had to be right because God wouldn't have sent us Galen if Galen was going to tell us things that weren't true. So that's the way you need to think about the medieval mind, that the only questions that are worth answering are the ones that the Bible or someone like Galen, accepted by the church, give us answers to. Other questions don't need to be asked, because if they were important enough to be asked, then God would have given us the answers in the Bible, and he didn't. So don't ask the questions. Unfortunately for medical progress, Galen dissected animals rather than humans, famously dissecting a pig, cutting the pig's basically its nerves in its neck, stopping it from squealing as it was being cut open. So Galen was investigating animals and then extrapolating and building on those and thinking, well, this is what it tells us about humans, which, there is some correlation, but it's not the same thing. So various mistakes that Galen made were then taken to be true all the way through the Middle Ages. Okay, and it was because of the fact that the church upheld Galen, even to the extent that in the church universities, the people who were being trained as doctors, the closest thing to doctors, which were physicians, when they were being trained as a university educated doctor, really all they did was learn word by word the works of Galen, and some other doctors as well, some other ancient authors as well, but really just learning those, not questioning them, not investigating, not doing their own anatomy courses or anything like that, just learning word for word the writings of Galen and Hippocrates. And the exams at the end would be, can you recite word for word the works of Galen over a week, and that would be your exam. Maybe not even a written exam. You have to stand in front of the university professor and recite the words of Galen until you've passed, basically. So that was the kind of education that took place based on Galen, rather than being based on what you might find out by looking at the human body itself. Okay, so those are the influences that kind of came to the medieval world from both the ancient world when you're thinking about the development of the first hospitals, etc., and the Greek and Roman world, thinking about the four humours, and the Arab world when you're seeing this more advanced medicine that then is influencing or beginning to influence what happens in Europe. The Middle Ages runs from about, well, in our case, it runs from the year 1000 up to about 1450s, when we begin to see more influence from the East coming into Europe with the beginnings of the Renaissance, and we see some of the things that had developed in Eastern medicine actually being developed as well in medicine in Europe. But throughout the Middle Ages, that process is not really happening. So in our next little video, we will, I'm sure you can't wait, we will start looking at, the provision of medicine in the Middle Ages. So I hope that's been helpful, and I'll load up another one shortly. Thank you. Bye-bye.